And welcome everyone to the event. Thank you, CFO India, for inviting me. So I don't have a presentation, but I'll talk you through something that you will find useful on the topic of the strategic CFO, or maybe the CFO of the future. And a good way to start this discussion is to perhaps take a 360-degree view of what is happening in the world around us, pick up the threads of where the noise is coming from, where the signals are coming from, and maybe just spend a few minutes thinking about what has really changed from the way the world was a few years back. I think depending on where you want to start, maybe the capital market is a good place to start with. We're all, of course, familiar with what's happening in stock markets. They've been pretty volatile, both in India as well as in the US. And the answer to that lies in interest rate markets and the way interest rates are going to be moving, both in India as well as the US, and depends on where you have taken a position on how quickly interest rates are going up. But the fact of the matter is that for a long period of time, the world has seen low interest rates, which have meant that there has been easy flow of capital. And now that we are placed on the cusp of interest rates perhaps going up, there is going to be volatility and churn happening. But certainly flow of capital has been something that we've all seen in the last few years. And that's been a defining moment from a CFO's perspective. If you also look at what's happening in the country and generally the corporate environment, I think the most important phenomena that we have all witnessed and experienced is the concept of working from home. Because of the pandemic, of course, we have worked for an extended period of time from home. And for example, if I take the anecdote of my team, I estimate that about 40% of my team has actually never seen the inside of an office, or at least our office, because many of them joined in the last nearly about a year and a half or 2 years since the pandemic broke out. And indications are that even when the world quote unquote normalizes, we will only get back to a hybrid mode of working where organizations and companies, particularly large companies, will have a certain degree of tolerance to people working in some part at least from home. So that's been a very important defining moment or experience in the last few years. Of course, the pandemic has forced significant change in customer behavior. I don't need to talk to you about this. We've all seen this. There has been a shift to digital, shift to online shopping. And of course, now people are returning back to physical shopping. So it's quite interesting to see many of the investments that have been made in the pandemic phase. How do they play out? And how does customer behavior really settle at? And like all things, customers' behavior will settle somewhere in the middle. They will have embraced online shopping and online browsing and consumption habits more than in the past. But of course, they will start beginning to return to physical aspects of consumption and indulgence soon. If you continue with that 360-degree view, and you perhaps take a look again at capital markets, we have seen, of course, a number of IPOs that have come up. There has been a lot of talk about the birth of unicorns in the last few years, and more recently, rather, the explosion of unicorns. And you do have news about a lot of unicorns being born every other month, and the numbers only seem to be accelerating. Equally, if you take a closer look at stock markets, you will also have seen that the free hand of the market has punished the valuation of some of these unicorns, and those who have had the courage to come out and do an IPO have seen a certain degree of retreat in their valuation in the last few weeks. But overall, if you step back and look at a longer term horizon, we've been in an era where unicorns have been born. But equally, the era of the future will be a little uncertain in terms of what really drives valuation. And if you humor me and continue with the 360-degree scan of what's happening in the environment, I mean, there are a lot of interesting stuff also going on. If you're watching Shark Tank, I'm sure many of you are interested and probably track the memes that are going around. And if you track the news about the NSE issue, there is a lot of interesting discussion which comes in about corporate governance and about ethical behavior and controls, etc., which of course every CFO should be aware of. If you continue with that scan and sort of get into technology, I think there is no dispute in the fact that in the last decade or so, the world has digitized. Cloud computing makes computing power equitable available for everyone, and a small startup has much access to computing power as a very large organization, and that actually spurs digitization. Anyone who knows how to write a code can actually write an app, and you can gather data and information, and you can actually build a business model. And I think that's another thing that I want to cover when we look into the future, the abundance of data and information all around us, and the digitization of business models. So I spent a few minutes, therefore, talking about what's happening in the world around us. It's pretty interesting. I think I want to put it down into a framework, and many of you may have heard about this framework earlier. I think the pace of change in the environment around us has accelerated pretty significantly. There is an acronym which describes the phase in which we are, that's VUCA. I'm sure most of you have heard it. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So the world around us is pretty volatile. You don't know whether the bubble that is built up over in valuations, etc., or the stock market indices, is that bubble going to burst, or is it still some distance away? And is it a secular bull run in that sense? So you don't know whether things are going up or they're going to go down. So there is a lot of volatility, and a few days they go up and a few days they go down. And depending on what happens to Russia and Ukraine, for example, things could swing either way, even in the future, just to take an example of a very topical event. Things are also pretty uncertain. The entire regulatory environment, for example, governments are wakening up, taxation is becoming global in nature, and of course, a lot of rules are coming in as governments try to harness large technology companies. And there is a certain degree of distrust, which we must all recognize, which is probably built up in the environment, not just in India, but also globally. And as a CFO, one must be aware of what regulations will come in. And as any CFO knows, regulations that come in bring a certain degree of uncertainty about who they will benefit and and what impact they will have. And therefore, uncertainty is an important vector in the future that every CFO will have to deal with. Things are obviously getting complex, and there is no better dimension to this complexity than to look at our tax rules. I mean, every year a new aspect of tax gets added. For example, you've got whatever virtual digital assets being taxed, and the definition itself is ambiguous. So that's an example of things becoming more complex. And if you are in a cross-border world, I think the taxation in cross-border transactions, especially if they're digital in nature, can give one a serious headache for an extended period of time. So there is a lot of complexity that is also building up. And complexity also comes from the fact that there is a change in technology, a change in the way in which we do business. And for a long period of time, you may have had a mental map about what your competitors look like. And you suddenly realize that the old competition is not the only competition you need to contend with. There are a lot of digital players that are probably coming into your particular industry, you're crowded out for the opportunity to serve customers. And of course, there is a lot of ambiguity. Many of the rules that have been framed or are continue to get framed are highly ambiguous in nature. And a great example is also the rule again about the digital assets being taxed. And I'm sure many of you have read those articles. There is lack of clarity about what is to be taxed and what is not to be taxed, and what all can fall into that tax net. So there is indeed a lot of ambiguity in the world around us. To take a very different example, how do you do your real estate planning in the future? Do you assume that everyone will come back to work, or will people be in a hybrid mode? And if it's in a hybrid mode, will people be comfortable staying away from office for an extended period of time? So this is a degree of ambiguity. This is an example of ambiguity that probably we never had to deal with in the past. So very simple. So I summarized it by saying that the environment around us is volatile, it is uncertain, it is getting more and more complex, and it is also ambiguous. You don't know which way to turn. So as a CFO sitting at the center of this, and with a responsibility to provide leadership to your entire team, how do you think about it and how do you react about it? So my simple rules and my experience is something like this. There is enough and more to distract people from a volatility perspective. And I think the best way to counter volatility is to emphasize on the vision for your organization. And the vision is something that should not change, even though things may be volatile around us. A simple example, if I were to speak for my position as Amazon, our vision is simply to be Earth's most customer centric company. Now, we'll never get done on that vision. And we will never be able to wake up one day and say, hey, you know what? We are Earth's most customer centric company. But whatever be the volatility around us, I think we stay anchored on our vision, that we continue to we have an opportunity to get better because customers are changing, that we need to be more customer centric today than we were yesterday. And similarly, you may be working for an organization which may have expressed its vision in some other way. I think an important test of your vision is that despite the volatility around you, that vision should not change. And that vision really sort of guides many of your decisions that you may be faced in the short and medium term. So one mantra or one guiding principle is always anchor things around your vision. If you don't have a vision, build a vision. If you have a vision, dust it up and make sure it can really guide you in these sort of volatile times. Next point, I mentioned about uncertainty. And I remember hearing this great quote from one of the senior business partners I was privileged to work with several years back. He made a point that when you're a leader and you're surrounded by uncertainty, your team always expects you to give certainty. They will come to you in a town hall or whatever forum that may be there, and they expect that you as a leader will give you the will answer or dispel uncertainty. They'll probably ask questions like, boss, when am I going to get promoted? Or boss, what is our increment going to be like? Or it may even be, what launch are we going to do, and how many people are we going to hire, and what is our organization going to look next year or so. As a leader, it's sometimes hard to deal with uncertainty. But this particular leader I was working with responded by saying, while people expect and demand certainty from you, what you should give them is absolute clarity. And there is a lot of difference between clarity and certainty. The certainty you can't give because you don't know what things are going to happen in future. But as a leader, it's your job to communicate and give clarity to what people are seeking. If to take that random transactional example, if somebody comes and asks me, boss, when am I going to get promoted? I do not want to give him certainty about when he's going to get promoted. But what I think I have a responsibility as his or her manager is to say that to get promoted, this is what you need to deliver. Yeah. So item A, item B, item C, or maybe this is a skill that you need to demonstrate, or these are the results that you need to sort of put on the table, or this is the capability that you need to build. So give clarity for the framework in which decisions are taken. And that, I think, goes a long way and manages the expectation that leaders will have, which you cannot meet, of being able to give certainty in this volatile world. So that's a little bit of mantra on the second vector of uncertainty. And I summarized it by saying, while people may expect certainty from you, make sure that you at least serve clarity and communicate clarity in whatever you do. The third part of VUCA is, of course, complexity. And I think this is where a CFO plays a very important role. There is a tendency to complicate a lot of things, keep things simple, whether it's your decision-making framework, whether it is the IT systems that you're investing in, or whether it is the policies that you've got. Remember, as you grow in scale, dealing and managing with complexity is a significant burden that you carry as a large leader, or even as a CFO of a small or a mid-sized organization. Keep things simple, keep things unbureaucratic, empower the front line, and make sure that decision making happens quickly, which is what you need when you keep things simple. So don't build very complex organization structures. Don't build very complex IT systems. Don't have very complex rules for taking decisions, etc. Just keep things simple about what needs to be done. And more often than not, you will find it's a better way to deal with the growing complexity around us. Of course, it's a little bit of a skill and an art about how do you keep things simple. The fourth vector I talked about was ambiguity, which is you don't know whether things are black or they're white or they're shades of gray. And I think the more important point about dealing with ambiguity is build an agile organization or be agile in your thinking. Ultimately, if you see shades of gray, they may turn out to be black or they may turn out to be white. But it's important to be agile, that when the environment around you changes, you're able to respond very simply, very quickly. It may be in the way in which you've allocated your headcount. It may be in the way in which you do budgeting, as an example. And that's actually a great example. Historically, organizations and CFOs have loved the concept of, let's say, 3-year plans or even annual plans. In a complex world when things are changing and you don't know what next month or next quarter is going to look like, it's more important to keep your planning horizon short, which is, let's say, 3 months or so, and maybe build up a series of quarterly forecasts rather than a single point annual forecast, which you do once a year or a 3-year forecast. That will allow you to be agile, to reallocate your resources, and to be able to set targets and change targets beyond a sort of a quarter. So building an agile organization is really sort of important for a CFO in all of this. I also had spoken to you earlier about what's happening in capital markets, whether interest rates are going down or going up, valuations are going up or going down. What is happening to unicorns? There are more unicorns being born today every month than there were in the past. Equally, at the same time, the valuation of some of these companies is at risk for a whole number of reasons. So what's the suggestion or the feedback or the way to think about all of this? Here are my rules of generally basis my observation of what really works. Number one, make sure that your organization is focused on the customer. Yeah, it could be an internal customer if you're talking about finance and finance processes, or if you're talking about your entire organization for which you're the CFO or the CXO. Make sure that your organization is focused on the customer. Are you serving the customer well or not? Are you observing the customer's behavior or not? Is her or his behavior changing? Are there competitors who are serving your customer better than you are serving? And in what way has your customer changed from what is there in the past? I think if you keep your organization focused on the customer, that's really important. Very often, we define our objectives in very internal metrics that we will build this product and make it successful. That's a very common mishap, that because you fall in love with a certain product or a service, you say that you will build the world's best product or the world's best service. But the customer who consumes that product or service may be changing, and you often lose sight whether that customer is being served or not. So make sure that my rule number one is to make sure that your organization stays focused on the customer in terms of the metrics that you're tracking and the non-financial numbers that you track. Are you sort of focused on serving the customer well? And internally also, if you're in a support function, make sure that you're very clear about the customers that you're serving internal in the organization and whether they're sort of being served well to ultimately serve the external customer. So customer-centric organization is rule number one. The second rule, especially since I'm speaking to CFOs, is make sure that you don't lose sight of cash flows. Yeah, cash flows. There is this beautiful quote, of course, about vanity, reality, and sanity being the difference between whether you look at revenues, when you look at accounting profits, and you look at cash flows. And the quote goes on to say that reality is actually just the cash flows. The cash flows is what is reality. As a CFO, make sure that you understand your cash flows very well and you have a future view on your cash flows, and any discussions and decisions that you take are basis long-term cash flows or the net present value of future cash flows. Very often this also gets talked about as value creation, which I think the building block to value creation is really whether you're focused on cash flows or not. The trick and the dilemma and the challenge really comes when you combine rule number 1 and rule number 2. Rule number 1 was stay focused on the customer and serve your customer better than anyone else. And rule number 2 was keep an eye on your cash flows. And I think the way to combine both of them, if you think of them as two circles and intersecting together, is make sure that your cash flows are focused and linked to metrics that measure the health of your customer and how well you're serving your customer. Yeah. So if you can construct a very simple equation for your cash flows, which is not necessarily your profit, which is vertical, which is revenue minus costs, variable and fixed costs leading to cash flows. But if you can write an equation for the cash flows of your business, which links them with the number of customers you've got, how engaged your customers are, what value you're getting out of it, minus the cost of serving those customers, and you're able to project it into the future, that I think is really the holy grail that CFOs need to make sure that their organization is anchored around, which is cash flows, and especially long-term cash flows on it. The third important thing, and I had brought out in a lighter way or a not so lighter way, all the stories about the Shark Tank gentleman and maybe the NSE CEO or ex-CEO, whatever. I think corporate governance is supremely important. It will never go out of fashion. It'll you may build an organization which is fantastic on cash flows and fantastic on serving the customer, but if the building blocks of corporate governance are not in place, I would wager that you're actually building a foundation which is very shaky, and you will have an accident someday. Corporate governance never gets a CFO promoted, but putting it in place can prevent you from getting fired. And it is absolutely the expectation that every CFO will pay attention to the bedrock or the foundation of his or her business. Are your goals and metric, are your P&L and balance sheet numbers being accurately reported or not? Are you test checking them or not? Are checks and balances built into the way your organization takes decisions? Is there accountability for leaders or not? And is there independence for the board? And is the board tracking what is really happening on some of the leaders? And equally down in the organization, are you making sure that you have a code of ethics and you have a mechanism to make sure that when these ethics are violated, they are immediately reported, investigated, and then the appropriate action is taken? It is so very important, and you can relate to all of the stories and some of the salacious memes and whatever are going around. It's important to keep corporate governance in place. The fourth rule that I would call out is really building the capability of the finance team, which of course is supremely important. And especially as the world becomes more and more digital, it's quite possible that people in the future, a finance team, need to have skill set which is different from what is there in the past. We are moving in that direction, but I don't really know the speed at which we are moving. I think there are two aspects to capability. There is skills, and then there is, of course, the people that you're hiring. You need to make sure that your organization has more processes that are digital in nature. You need to make sure, for example, let's talk about digital organizations per se. And I could spend a long time just talking about it. In some of the other talks that I've given, I've spoken about the value of data, and especially data and digital, of course, go hand in hand. As organizations get more digital, you're just bombarded and swimming in data. I think the true test of a CFO comes if you're able to move that organization to move from data to information, and recognize that there's a difference between data. Data is commodity, it is a raw material. Information is semi-processed or processed. You're able to organize your data in ways that it is meaningful to analyze. That is information. From that information, you must have the tools to be able to extract insights. Yeah. Otherwise, a lot of data and a lot of information is absolutely useless if you're unable to mine them for the right kind of insights and trends that are happening. So building the analytics engine to be able to extract insights from information is again a very critical part. The next leg in that journey is to move the organization from insights into action. You can otherwise build a very supremely analytical organization where you're probably bombarded with insights. But if the organization is very bureaucratic and you're not wired to be able to act on those insights, I would argue that all of it is useless. So basically, make sure that your insights translate into actions. And these actions can be small actions or quick actions, but build a culture where your frontline is empowered to pick up these insights and take decisions. And unlike in the monolithic organizations of the past, where decisions are only taken at the top, here you should empower your frontline to take decisions, because that is how the speed of actions will increase. And one will have to be more agile, more nimble, as I explained a little while earlier. The holy grail on that dimension of data to information, information to insights, insights to action comes at the last part, which is from action. Are you able to predict what is going to happen in the future? And that's, I think, really important. At some simple level, all of us who have done S&OP planning know and understand this. S&OP planning at a very simple level is the capability to predict what is going to happen in the future. But of course, that may be at your overall demand level. The ability to do that at a customer level and at a cash flow level, and to do it together and to link it with what if analysis becomes really important. You should be able to use your historical data to organize into information, draw insights from it, make sure that your organization is wired up to convert the insights into action, and then make sure that you have other analytical capability to then predict the impact of that action and then vary your action to get to the right output in the future and not just the present. So that's the grain that you need to do. The other thing is to always recognize that change is always going to be around us, and we all have to be comfortable dealing with change. So I'm broadly nearing the end of my talk, Anisha. So I had summarized at the beginning by taking a 360-degree view of what is happening in the world around us. I then gave you a little bit of a framework that the world around us is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I said you should counter volatility with vision, uncertainty with clarity. You should counter ambiguity by building an agile organization and keep things simple. Then I talked about the building an organization or a CFO that's customer focused. Then I talked about cash flows and the importance. Then I spoke about corporate governance. And then I spoke about capability. And then I said change is the only constant. And I also realized coincidentally that they all start with a C. So that brings me to the end of my talk, and I hope I've given you something to chew about. Thank you very much, and back to you, Anisha.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. What you've spoken about today is pure gold. It's, I'm sure, music to the ears of all who's listening, because these are real everyday challenges and things that we must keep inside. There's so much to deal with, but things that you must come back to every day to reinforce the ethos of your company, to keep its vision on track. Thank you so much for joining us.